Hi everyone, I'm Vanessa Hughes and I'll be leading us in this week's daily devotionals. We're focusing this week on 2 Samuel and we're going to be narrowing in our focus on just chapters 1 to 10, where overall the picture is that David takes the throne and things go well. Before we jump into chapter 1, I'd love us just to take note that 2 Samuel obviously follows on from 1 Samuel. But it was originally just written as one literary piece, and so the narrative flows easily from 1 Samuel to 2 Samuel. Remembering that 1 Samuel, the focus is on the prophet Samuel and King Saul, whereas from 2 Samuel you'll notice the focus is really only on David. Well, the turning point came for us in 1 Samuel chapter 16, where David was anointed and received God's Holy Spirit. But Saul was still God's king. He was king in name only. And as the book of 1 Samuel comes to an end, we see that Saul has been killed. He's even fallen at the hands of Israel's great army. David, throughout the book of 1 Samuel, had 2 opportunities to kill Saul. But he thought it was unthinkable to kill the Lord's anointed. And so David, who was humble of heart, the smallest among his brothers, was always dedicated to following Yahweh's prophetic instruction. And that's key for understanding David. Well, with that picture in mind, let me read to us from chapter 1. I'm going to read through to verse 15. After the death of Saul, David returned from striking down the Amalekites and stayed in Ziklag 2 days. On the 3rd day, a man arrived from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and dust on his head. When he came to David, he fell to the ground to pay him honor. "Where have you come from?" David asked. He answered, "I have escaped from the Israelite camp." "What happened?" David asked. "Tell me." "The men fled from the battle," he replied. "Many of them fell and died, and Saul and his son Jonathan are dead." Then David said to the young man who brought him the report, "How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" "I happened to be on Mount Gilboa," the young man said, "and there was Saul, leaning on his spear, with the chariots and their drivers in hot pursuit. When he turned around and saw me, he called out to me, and I said, 'What can I do?' He asked me, 'Who are you?' 'An Amalekite,' I answered. Then he said to me, 'Stand here by me and kill me. I'm in the throes of death, but I'm still alive.' So I stood beside him and killed him, because I knew that after he had fallen he could not survive. And I took the crown that was on his head and the band on his arm and have brought them here to my Lord." Then David and all the men with him took hold of their clothes and tore them. They mourned and wept and fasted till evening for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for the great army, for the army of the Lord, and for the nation of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. David said to the young man who brought him the report, "Where are you from?" "I am the son of a foreigner, an Amalekite," he answered. David asked him, "Why weren't you afraid to lift your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" Then David called one of his men and said, "Go strike him down." So he struck him down and he died. For David had said to him, "Your blood be on your own head. Your own mouth testified against you when you said, 'I killed the Lord's anointed.'" Well, there's a few things to notice here. Firstly, as chapter 1 begins, we see that the narrative has indeed just continued from the end of 1 Samuel. After the death of Saul, we're just picking up the story as it continues on. And notice in verse 10 that David has received the crown. And so the crown that was on Saul's head is now transferred into David's hand. However, years of civil war come next. So the house of Saul still pursues David. We see in this chapter the death of Saul, but that's not something that David is rejoicing in. The same restraint that he showed in 1 Samuel by not killing the Lord's anointed, David now shows that same respect as he mourns and weeps and fasted for the death of Saul and Jonathan. And if you look ahead in chapter 1, you'll see that there's a great song of lament for Saul and Jonathan. Well, notice also that David does not want Saul's blood on his hands. He committed to this consistent and commendable dependence on Yahweh and his timing and his plans to appoint David to the throne. And so even though this man seemed to have shown compassion towards Saul to kill him as he was dying, David does not want his blood on his hands. And this is important for us. As the narrative across chapters 1 through to 4 continues, we see the death of Abner, who in chapter 3 we read is also part of the house of Saul, and the death of Saul's son Ishbosheth, who is also pursuing David and trying to claim the crown. So these years of civil war we see depicted by the house of Saul against the house of David. And as each one of these fall, Saul, Abner, Ishbosheth, which is this natural and necessary movement of God toward God leading David to his anointed position as king of Israel, David does not abandon his great restraint and dependence on God. So read now the opening of chapter 2. In the course of time, David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I go up to one of the towns of Judah?" he asked. The Lord said, "Go up." David asked, "Where shall I go?" "To Hebron," the Lord answered. And so we see here David is still depending on the prophetic word of Yahweh to direct his path, and he's faithfully relying on God's timing. And notice in chapter 3, verses 38 to 39, David says, "The king said to his man, 'Do you not realize that a commander and a great man has fallen in Israel this day? And today, though I am the anointed king, I am weak. And those sons of Zeruiah are too strong for me. May the Lord repay the evildoer according to his evil deeds.'" And so David's humble and small stature and weak disposition is still carried through here into 2 Samuel. Though David is the Lord's anointed and he is going to reign over Israel, we'll see that come together tomorrow. David maintains his restraint and his consistent and commendable reliance upon God. Though those who are mounting war against him, this civil war, are dying, and David succeeds to his position over Israel, he does not rejoice in their deaths. He humbly grieves them and he respects and honors them as the Lord's anointed. We're going to finish that thought for the day, but I leave you with this. How do we go respecting those who come against us? Are we humble in victory? Do we still heavily rely upon Yahweh? I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.